That day I buried my wife, and by evening I learned that my son had buried my place in my own home. The morning began with a cold light that gave no warmth. The sun appeared for a brief moment, as if to check whether everything was ready for farewell, and then slipped back behind the heavy winter clouds. Frost had gripped the ground so tightly that the shovels rang as though striking stone. At the cemetery, there was the smell of damp earth mixed with faint smoke from faraway chimneys. I held my hat in my hands, feeling my fingers slowly grow numb from the cold, and watched as the casket was lowered into the ground. Mary was leaving quietly, the same way she had lived, without unnecessary words, with dignity, drawing no extra attention to herself but always leaving warmth behind. The priest spoke the customary words, but they did not reach me. All the voices around merged into a single monotonous background, like the sound of wind. In my mind, images flared and faded, Mary in the garden in her straw hat, watering the flowers, me bringing home a loaf of still warm bread and her meeting me at the door with a laugh, autumn evenings by the fireplace when we sat in silence, and that silence was the best conversation. Now all these scenes had a hard frame, they had become memories with no future beyond them. When we returned home, the silence hit harder than the frost. It was not the evening quiet of a house waiting for you to hang your coat and put the kettle on. It was a hollow emptiness where even footsteps sounded foreign. I placed my hat on the shelf, hung my coat, and saw my son standing in the doorway of the living room. His back was straight, hands in his pockets, his gaze firm, the look of a man who had already made a decision. He delivered his decision without the slightest hesitation. His voice was even, cold, and stripped of doubt, as if he were reading a prepared statement. And I understood. This was not a sudden impulse, not words spoken in the heat of emotion. It was a plan he had been moving toward, one in which I no longer had a place. I felt the walls that Mary and I had raised from bare earth suddenly become foreign. The warmth we had built over decades seemed to drain away, leaving only air in the rooms. Outside, the gray sky hung low, pressing down on the rooftops of neighboring houses. I looked at those clouds and realized that with my wife gone, I was also losing the home and the life where every morning had begun with her voice. Inside, everything tightened, but I did not let it break through. Not a single word escaped my lips. I simply stood there, listening, and deep down I began to understand that this day was not an ending. It was the start of a different game, one in which I would have to act quietly, but with precision. I knew that words would change nothing here. Everything that could have been said had already been decided for me, and any protest would only make my leaving noisy and humiliating. I didn't want to leave behind shouting or resentment, only silence. The house carried that particular winter scent old homes have, a mixture of wood, a cooled fireplace, and slightly damp carpets. I walked through the living room, each step echoed in the floor with a familiar creak. It felt as though the walls were watching me, as if I were taking something valuable with me. In the bedroom, in the far corner of the closet, sat my leather briefcase. Dark brown, with deep creases at the folds, yet the clasp still clicked shut firmly and precisely. I took it and placed it on the bed. Beside it, I set down a small suitcase, the same one I once carried on business trips. I packed slowly, deliberately. Nothing unnecessary, only what was truly mine. A couple of changes of clothes, my shaving kit, the old sweater Mary knitted for me in the first winter after our wedding. Each item carried a memory, making the suitcase feel heavier than it really was. The briefcase I filled with documents. Copies of deeds, bank statements, Mary's will, and the envelope with her handwriting. Open if they forget. I ran my fingers over the letters, clear, confident strokes, without flourishes. That handwriting always carried something of her, clarity and firmness. When everything was ready, I sat on the edge of the bed and closed my eyes for a minute. I wanted to take in this place, to remember it not as I saw it today, but as it had been when Mary still lived here. Back then, the silence in this room had been warm, not cold. I rose and went to the door. Walking down the hallway, my eyes lingered on framed photographs, me and my son by the river when he was still a teenager, a New Year's dinner where everyone was laughing, Mary holding a basket of apples. These photographs would stay here, and maybe one day someone would look at them and remember that this house began with love. I stepped down the stairs and out into the yard. The cold air stung my face, but there was something cleansing in it. Beyond the gates, the street lay quiet, with only the occasional car passing by, leaving tire tracks on a thin layer of frost. I stepped onto the sidewalk and felt that everything tying me to this house was now behind me, sealed inside the wooden gates. My departure was soundless, like falling snow. And in that silence, something new was already forming, a plan, not yet shaped into words, but alive inside me. I walked through the morning city, feeling how every street gave me its cold. The wind slipped under my collar, but inside I was warmer than outside. Not because I was calm, simply because my thoughts kept me warm. They carried me back, to where my story with that house began. 30 years ago, the plot of land where it stood was nothing but an empty piece of earth. Knee-high weeds, a couple of old apple trees, and a rusty gate leading to nowhere. But I already saw the silhouette of the house in that patch of dirt. I saw its kitchen with big windows where the morning light would fall across the table. I saw the fireplace in the living room, where Mary and I would sit on winter evenings. The construction was long and hard. I worked 2 jobs, and in the evenings I came here to hammer a few nails, straighten the beams, or fit hinges to the doors. Mary would arrive with a thermos of coffee, sit on a stack of boards, and wait for me to take a break. Sometimes she laughed when, exhausted, I tried to fit a window straight, only for it to tilt stubbornly. We both knew this house would stand as long as it was filled with people who loved it the way we did. I remember our first winter there down to the smallest details. The fireplace crackled, the floors still smelled of fresh wood, and in the kitchen, an apple pie baked in the oven. Our son was just a boy then, running through the house like it was a castle. He loved that you could hide in every room and that the stairs creaked on the 3rd step. He called it our secret signal. The years passed. The house changed with us. New trees grew in the garden, new tiles appeared in the kitchen, and new photographs on the walls of the living room. Every mark on the floor, every scratch on the stair railing had its own story. Even the crack in one of the window frames was not just a flaw. It appeared the day our son, in a burst of teenage anger, slammed it shut too hard. For me, that house was more than walls and a roof. It was a witness to everything we had lived through. Joy, grief, victories, defeats. It was where Mary celebrated her happiest days and where we saw her through her last. It was where I taught my son to hammer his first nail, and where we, both grown men, fixed the roof together after a storm. Now, as I walked away, it felt like the house still breathed our story. And I knew its walls remembered more than the people inside. But unlike them, the walls do not betray. I rented a small room in a modest hotel on the edge of town. The place was quiet, with almost no other guests. Outside my window lay an empty parking lot, and beyond it, a frost-covered field. The room was simple, a bed with a neatly made blanket, a nightstand with a lamp, and a chair by the window. It was all I needed to be alone with my thoughts. I placed the briefcase on the table and slowly opened it. Inside, neatly arranged, were the documents I had gathered and guarded for years. I picked up the envelope with Mary's handwriting. The white paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the words, "Open if they forget," looked as though she had written them yesterday. I remembered that evening. We were sitting by the fireplace, the fire casting a warm glow over her face. She placed the envelope on my lap and told me she wanted me to keep it. I had asked her what it was, and she replied, "Only for the most extreme case." I hadn't opened it then, though my curiosity urged me to. I kept my word, because I knew Mary never said anything without reason. Now, that moment had come. I slit open the edge of the envelope and pulled out several pages. It was an addendum to her will, officially notarized, with her signature and seals. It stated clearly, if our son ever raised a hand against me, insulted me, or tried to drive me out of the house, he would automatically lose his rights to his share of the inheritance and the property. I leaned back in the chair, holding those pages in my hands. Mary had foreseen this day. She knew that time changes people, and that blood is not always protection from betrayal. She had left me this document as a shield, but it was a shield to be used with care. Next, I took the other bundle of papers. These were copies of contracts, mortgage documents, and payment receipts, many of them signed by both Mary and me. This meant I wasn't just a resident of the house, but a co-owner. Even if my son wanted me gone, he could not do it without my consent. With each page I read, I felt calmer. Not because I wanted revenge, no. Simply because I knew I had not been stripped of everything, as he might have believed. I had time, I had resources, and most importantly, I had a plan that was beginning to take shape with deliberate precision. I placed all the papers back into the briefcase, snapped the lock shut, and set it beside the bed. Outside, the evening was closing in. A thin, frosty mist spread across the field, hiding the distant lights. In that stillness, I felt Mary was still here, not in voice, not in touch, but in these sheets of paper where she had left me her care and her protection. I woke early before dawn. The hotel room was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the old heater as it pushed out warmth. On the nightstand sat my briefcase, and I could feel its presence setting the rhythm of my thoughts. Today I needed to make the first move, the one that would determine everything that came after. I brewed myself a strong coffee from the cheap hotel packet. The bitter taste sharpened my mind, and the plan in my head became clear. There would be no place in this game for haste or emotion. Only calculation, a cold sequence of steps, and documents. My first stop was the notary's office I had worked with back when Mary was alive. A small office on the second floor of an old brick building, it greeted me with the smell of paper, ink, and a faint trace of dust. Everything was just as I remembered: the heavy desk of the secretary, shelves lined with folders, narrow windows through which the morning light streamed in long golden stripes. I showed the notary Mary's envelope and her addendum to the will. He read each page carefully, slowly nodding. His expression said more than his words. The document was flawless. Every detail was in place: signatures, seals, proper form. It meant I now had a legal instrument capable of changing the balance entirely. We made several notarized copies. One I left in the office's archive, another I placed in a safe deposit box at the bank. The third I kept with me, not to use immediately, but as a reminder that my position was stronger than my son imagined. From the notary's, I went straight to the bank. There I rented a separate safe deposit box for all my key documents, copies of deeds, receipts, the will, and the papers on the house. Now, even in the event of an unexpected visit or theft, no one could take away what was rightfully mine. Back at the hotel, I sat by the window and watched the street below. Cars moving slowly, the rare pedestrian passing by, the morning light glinting off thin ice on the asphalt. I thought about how this first step in my game had been made. It was quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but I knew moves like this were the ones that led to victory in the end. That evening I took out a notebook and began writing down all the next steps. Each action needed to be deliberate: who to meet, what information to gather, which boundaries to set. This was not revenge. This was taking back the right to control my own life. I closed the notebook, placed it in the briefcase, and allowed myself a moment to rest. Outside, twilight deepened, and the light of the few street lamps turned the snowy air a warm amber. In that stillness, I felt certain. I had begun. Several days passed before I found myself near the house again. Not inside, no, I had no intention of crossing that threshold unless absolutely necessary. But I chose a spot across the street, where a small park began beyond an icy fence. From there, I could see the house's facade, its windows, and the frozen, shadowed branches of the old apple trees. I sat on a bench, pretending to feed sparrows. In truth, I was watching. Not so much what happened inside, but the rhythm in which the house now lived. When the light in the living room turned on, when the mailman came, which neighbors stopped by, and which passed without lifting their eyes. It was reconnaissance, quiet, invisible, but necessary. My son knew I was somewhere nearby. We hadn't met face to face, but I saw him glance out the window once or twice, his eyes lingering before he let the curtain fall. He said nothing, and that silence was as eloquent as words. It meant he was waiting for my move but had no idea what it would be. I stayed silent as well. No calls, no letters, no attempts to meet. This gave me time. Time to solidify my position, verify the documents, and check every detail. The longer the pause lasted, the more it worked in my favor. That evening I returned to the hotel and sat for a long while by the window, staring at the empty street. Beyond the glass, in the frosty haze, the streetlights blurred into golden smudges. I thought of the years when Mary and I lived in that house without locks on the inside doors, when it never occurred to us that we might need to protect ourselves from those we loved. And the sharper those memories became, the firmer my resolve grew to see this through to the end. In the days that followed, I began moving carefully. A few calls to my lawyer, a couple of visits to the archives, one meeting with an old friend who had once been my colleague. Each of these steps looked random, but all were part of the same design. I wanted everything ready so that when the moment came, not a single move could be challenged. The silence continued. It grew heavy, thick, like winter air before a snowstorm. And I knew, when it ended, something would change forever. That day I was sitting in the hotel lobby, going over old notes in my notebook. Outside, fine snow was falling, quiet, persistent, as if it knew no one would disturb it. I had grown used to the solitude of the past few weeks, so when someone spoke my name, I looked up in surprise. Standing before me was Thomas, an old neighbor with whom I had lived side by side for nearly 20 years. Back then, he would often stop by for tea, help mend a fence, or mow the grass. But after Mary's passing, our paths drifted apart, and I hadn't expected to see him here. He sat across from me, not rushing to start the conversation. Only when the waitress brought us coffee did Thomas lean forward and quietly say that he knew what had happened. About my son, about how I'd been driven out, and about my silence. I didn't deny it. He went on, telling me he had seen my son in recent months meeting with certain people whose reputation Thomas knew all too well. These were not the sort of people interested in a home for living, but in a profitable asset. They had spoken about selling the land, demolishing the old house, and building something new. Thomas's words were an unpleasant but necessary confirmation of my suspicions. I understood that my son didn't simply want me gone, he intended to rid himself of the house itself, the one Mary and I had built over years. Thomas then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. On it, he said, were recordings from the security cameras on his property. The cameras captured part of my street, and on those recordings were conversations and meetings outside my house, things I could not see from afar. He handed me the drive and said he had kept a copy for himself, in case I needed proof. I thanked him, and in that moment I realized I was no longer alone. I had an ally, someone I could trust. Not because he was an old friend, but because he had his own reason to help. Thomas didn't want his street to be turned into a construction site either. That evening I reviewed the footage. Faces, gestures, fragments of conversations, all of it formed a clear picture. My son's plan was simple: remove me, secure full ownership of the house and land, and sell it all for a high price. I closed the laptop and felt something shift inside me. If before I had been ready to act alone, now I had support. And that meant my next move would be stronger than he could possibly imagine. I decided I could not wait any longer. Every week gave my son the chance to strengthen his position, and me, the risk of losing time. Now that I had Thomas and his recordings, I could act with more confidence. But I had to move with precision, not impulse, making sure each step carried real consequences. The first thing I did was visit my lawyer. Together, we filed an official request to the land registry to obtain the complete set of documents for the house and property. I wanted to make certain that no hidden changes in ownership had been made. A few days later, the reply arrived. Everything remained unchanged. My share of the house and land was still legally secured in my name. This was a key point. Next, I prepared a formal notice addressed to my son. In it, I clearly stated that any action regarding the property without my consent would be contested in court, and that any attempt to sell or demolish the house would result in him losing his share of the inheritance in accordance with Mary's addendum to the will. I sent the letter by registered mail with confirmation of delivery so it would be officially recorded. But I knew a warning alone wasn't enough. I had to strip him of the confidence that he could act without consequence. To that end, I contacted the city's Historical Preservation Office. Our house had been built in a unique architectural style, and though we had never considered it before, it could potentially qualify for protected status. If the house were recognized as historically valuable, demolishing it would become a long and difficult process requiring special permits. Through Thomas, I passed part of the video recordings to a local newspaper journalist who had been looking for a reason to write about how old houses were vanishing from the city to make way for new shopping centers. I knew that a publication like that would strike not only at my son's plans, but also at his reputation. All of these actions might have looked unrelated, but in truth they were part of a single strategy. My son likely had no idea that the game was no longer being played on his terms. That evening, I met with Thomas again. We sat in his workshop, surrounded by the scent of wood and the presence of old tools, discussing our next moves. He suggested rallying a few more neighbors who were unhappy with the rumors of construction. The more of us there were, the harder it would be for my son to push his plans through. When I returned to the hotel, fresh snow blanketed the streets, glittering like tiny shards of glass under the street lamps. I looked at the scene and knew the turning point had come. I was no longer defending, I was advancing. The day was cold, with a sharp wind that stung my cheeks. I walked slowly but with purpose, carrying a leather briefcase under my arm. Inside was everything I needed: copies of documents proving my rights, the notices he had already received, and evidence of his intentions. The house greeted me with silence. The snow on the porch was untouched, as if no one had stepped outside for days. I knocked on the door, and something shifted inside. Moments later, I stood face to face with the person I had once considered the closest to me. I looked at him and saw a mix of irritation and unease in his eyes. He had expected me to return broken or pleading. But I stood straight, calm, and that, it seemed, caught him off guard. We moved into the living room. The house inside appeared just as I remembered it, but the air was different, colder, heavier. The photographs still hung on the walls, yet they no longer warmed the space. I felt that this house was no longer mine in the familiar sense, but legally, it still belonged to me as much as to him. I opened the briefcase and took out a folder. I laid the papers out on the table so he could see each page: copies of the will, Mary's notarized addendum, registry documents, the formal notice with my conditions. They were arranged neatly, like chess pieces placed with deliberate care. I said nothing, but every movement I made spoke for me. This was neither a plea nor an attempt at reconciliation. It was a statement of fact. I was here, I was within my rights, and his plan was no longer an unobstructed road. He remained silent, but I could see his expression change. Irritation gave way to something heavier: understanding. He realized that from now on, his moves would be met with resistance. I gathered the papers back into the briefcase and stood. I looked at him again, at who he had become, and at who he once was. Stepping outside, I drew in the cold air and felt that this meeting had been a turning point. Not because it resolved the conflict, but because now we both knew, ahead lay an open game, and neither of us intended to yield. Several weeks passed after that meeting. I didn't return to the house and sought no further reason for direct conversation. Everything that needed to be done was already in place. The documents were in order, the legal barriers established, the allies ready. Now the next move was his. From time to time, Thomas brought me news. He said that those same people my son had been meeting with no longer came to the house. The talk of selling and demolishing it had gone quiet. Perhaps he realized that the path which once seemed easy was now tangled with too many obstacles. I spent my days in peace. Sometimes I took walks through the city, stopping at the library where Mary and I had once chosen books for our living room. Other times I simply sat by the hotel window, watching the street and recalling moments from another life. Not with longing, but with a gentle sadness, the kind you feel when looking at an old photograph you can no longer change. One morning I received a letter. It was short and without apologies, but its subtext was clear. My son acknowledged that any future actions regarding the house would be discussed with me. There was no reconciliation, no warmth, but that wasn't necessary. What mattered was that he no longer saw me as weak and defenseless. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. Spring was approaching, and the snow in the streets was melting faster each day. I knew I would soon leave this hotel room, but I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted to remain until I could feel the circle had truly closed. That evening, I opened the briefcase and looked through all the papers one last time. They were no longer weapons to me, but reminders, of Mary, of the house, of the fact that even in the most difficult moments, you can keep your place in life if you act with calm and certainty. Closing the briefcase, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in a long time. Not victory, but a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had done all I could. And that was enough.